Hello, everyone. Welcome here. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be tuning in from. Good morning.
Hello.
Good morning,
Hi,
everyone. Afternoon, evening.
All right, let us know in the chat where you might be joining us from. I'm based just outside of Vancouver, BC. What about our other panelists here today?
Yeah, I'm just not too far from Toronto, Ontario.
And I'm tuning in from Burnaby, Coquitlam, a little border area called Lougheed.
And I'm nearby to that in Port Moody.
Awesome. I think quite rainy for the three of us right now. What about you, Natalie?
Not bad. Getting over winter, so it's nice to see.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, it is that time, so I'll go ahead and kick us off here. Thanks, everyone, for letting us know where you're joining from as well. So welcome, everyone, to A Safer's Guide to Protecting Your Data with the FME Platform. I will hand things over to our presenters to introduce themselves. So starting off with Merlin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Merlin George. I work with the FME Flow support team and have been involved with helping our customers with their Flow installation, especially user management options and HTTPS configuration.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Cloutier. I am, like Merlin, a technical support specialist, only I am on the FME forum side of things. And just happy to help where I can with any FME forum related issues.
And I'm Richard Mosley. I'm a technical support specialist for FME Flow too, and I work with Merlin on that team.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And we also have Steve and Mandy joining us on the back end, supporting with Q&A. So we have a big team here to support answering any questions you might have throughout. So definitely get those into the questions tab, which, speaking of which, is located on the bottom right there. We also have the chat tab. So keep chiming in, letting us know where you're tuning in from. Share your reactions with us during the webinar using that react button on the bottom middle. And then if you do have any audio or video issues throughout, there's 4 simple troubleshooting steps. Just click that help button on the bottom left. With that, I will hand things back to Richard to go through our agenda.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of FME security. We're going to jump into a little bit about SAFE and FME for those who are new to FME. And then Natalie's going to take a look at some of the FME forum security features. This used to be called FME Desktop. And then Merlin's going to take us through FME Flow security features, formerly FME Server. And then I'm going to talk about some implementation considerations for FME Flow. Following that, we're going to introduce the Trust Center. This is coming out soon. It's one shop stop for everything security related. And then we're going to wrap things up by taking a look at our resources and having our question and answer period.
Perfect. At this point, I'll get us to turn off our webcams as we do have some upcoming demos to save on bandwidth.
All right, let's jump right into things. We're talking about security today because within FME, we talk about security a lot, and it's important that you feel as confident as we do about FME. There's a huge range of security concerns, and we're going to tackle a few of these which are applicable to FME. FME is a versatile tool that allows you to develop no-code workflows for almost any format. Our versatility is our strength, and similarly, FME can be securely deployed almost anywhere, allowing you to focus on the process. FME has a wide range of options to help you work within your organization's security practices. But we also have built-in defaults, such as password encryption, principle of least privilege, and control access. And as standards move, we keep up with them. For example, we no longer support TLS 1.1 and we're moving towards 1.3. But to make sure you're on top of all the changes we put into FME, you must make sure you upgrade to the latest version. FME is fully forward compatible, and we have tools that allow you to easily upgrade your workflows. In order to make FME as secure as it can be, it's important to understand your organization's security policies and best practices. What do your users authenticate with? SAML, LDAP? Where are your databases, data stores, and how can you connect to them? Where are people using FME? Is it all internal behind a firewall, or is it publicly accessible? It's important to understand these things to be able to understand how you can secure your server. We'll take a few minutes here to introduce FME. FME has been around for 29 years. We have 190 plus global partners, and we have over 20,000 active community users. The enterprise integration platform consists of 3 products: FME Form, where you create your workflows, connect to your data stores; FME Flow, where you automate and create real-time solutions; and FME Flow Hosted, which is where we host Flow in a cloud environment. FME started 30 years ago with the hard problem of spatial data. From there, we've added over 450 different formats, and we keep expanding. And we bring that same expertise that we did with spatial data to everything. I'm going to pass things off to Natalie now to discuss FME Form.
Thanks, Richard. As mentioned, this part of the presentation will give some insights into how FME Form can be configured to better meet your organizational information security requirements. My goal here today is to provide you with a high-level awareness-style overview of some of the features in FME Form which can enhance the security of your data. I'll echo Richard's sentiment and ask you to think about your own information security policies and try to picture how the features that I'll cover today might complement those policies. Hopefully, you will walk away with some new ideas on how you might enhance data security while performing your tasks with FME Form. Here are the specific topics that I'll focus on today, all in the context of FME Form. First, I want to spend a little bit of time discussing authentication methods supported in FME Form, and then I'll jump into FME Workbench and start walking through the remainder of these topics. Today, I'll be performing my demonstration in FME Workbench 2023 beta. Now let's take a look at some of the authentication methods supported in FME Form. This list isn't necessarily exhaustive. Some of our connectors and formats do offer methods which are specific to a target resource. However, these are the more common authentication methods you'll see throughout FME Form. Some of these do require specific system or network configurations to be in place, so it's good practice to consult our documentation if you are interested in implementing a particular authentication method in your workflows. Generally speaking, your organizational information security policies will guide you to the most appropriate authentication method, or at least narrow your choices. If, for example, your organization makes use of integrated Windows authentication, then your authentication methods in FME Form might include Kerberos and NTLM. I'm not going to go into each of these methods individually. They all have excellent authoritative documentation available. However, I do want to highlight 2 of them as they're specific to FME. That would be database connections and web connections. These are self-contained objects which specify a web service or database's key details, as well as the parameters needed to connect a user to these target resources, all stored outside of the workspace. In this way, FME can readily connect a user to a target resource while keeping sensitive information unexposed. All that is seen in the workspace is the connection's name and none of its particulars. If the connection parameters change, you can edit these from the appropriate connections table in FME options, and the changes will be reflected in any workspace which uses the edited connection. And you can see the connection names there in the images at right. Database and web connections can be reused as often as needed, saving users from repeatedly having to enter authentication information throughout their workspaces. Most of our database and web-based formats, as well as our connector transformers, make use of these connections for authentication, either exclusively or optionally. So getting familiar with establishing database and web connections is advantageous when working in FME. We'll revisit web and database connections shortly, so just keep this authentication information in mind as we return to the topic. So let's now jump into FME Workbench 2023 beta and take a tour of some of the features that you can configure to improve the security of those resources. So once again, in FME Workbench 2023 beta, and many of the features that I'm covering today are accessible through the FME Options menu, which is under the Tools tab. We'll just have a look at that now. So Tools and FME Options. However, I would like to first draw your attention to a couple of key security features external to FME Options. First, I'd like to show you the Workspace Password Parameter located under the Workspace Parameters option within the Navigator pane. A workspace password applies to the whole workspace file and protects it from unauthorized access. Simply double-clicking on this parameter will bring up a dialog which prompts you to enter a password for the workspace. Once the password is set and the workspace has been saved, only users who know that password will be able to open the workspace in FME Workbench to perform edits. The workspace can still be run in FME Quick Translator without requiring that password, so users can still make use of the translation. They just can't perform edits without the password. Workspace password protection enhances asset security in another interesting way too. Password-protected workspaces are encrypted. Workspace encryption is handy as FME workspace files can be opened in text editors like Notepad, for example. So here I have a simple workspace which is not password protected opened in Notepad. As you can see, I am presented with a lot of key workspace details here, and scrolling through this document, it's pretty easy to see the key elements of this translation. What's more, I can actually go in and edit these details, save them, and then have these changes reflected in the workspace when next viewed in FME Workbench. This is a very easy way someone can tamper with and potentially corrupt your workspace. However, when I open the same workspace, this time with a password applied in Notepad, the only information that is human readable is the series of comments at the top of the file. Everything else is encrypted, so all of the parameter definitions and the workflow itself and any other sensitive information is no longer legible. Now back to FME Workbench. Another practice that you could consider is temp file management. FME Form does create quite a few temp files during translation, and generally these temp files are cleaned up by FME once the program terminates cleanly. However, if for any reason FME does not terminate cleanly, temp files may persist. You can help manage your FME temp file location by occasionally purging temp files right here under the Tools menu. Selecting this Purge Temporary Files option will clean up your FME temp location just to make sure nothing sensitive is sitting in temp. One last feature to consider before jumping into FME options is license borrowing, also available from this Tools menu. This option is helpful if you require access to FME Form offline. You can borrow a floating license for up to 30 days, and the license is automatically returned at the end of the borrowing period. So if you're required to operate within higher security environments which do not allow network or internet access, FME Form can accommodate this need. To go completely offline, though, there are a couple of other settings you'll need to adjust for the start page and the help documentation. And I'll highlight these as we walk through FME options. So now let's get right into FME options. So Tools, FME options. And our first stop today on FME options is the Workbench menu at the top. This is where you'll find the Allow Network Access for Start Page setting, just under the general settings here. For full offline access to FME Form, you'll need to disable this setting. Once you apply that change, you won't have to worry about FME Form attempting the Start Page network connection in a secure environment. But I'm going to leave mine enabled for now. Our next stop is the Default Paths menu, about halfway down. Default Paths is where you can control access to a variety of your sensitive resources by setting up some sharing options for these resources. So the first section here, which is the Connection Storage section, is where you can set up sharing for your database and web connections. Once properly configured, you can choose which connections to share with other users and which ones to keep private to your own user profile. We have an excellent FME community article titled Making Database and Web Connections Public, which walks through how to adjust the data and public key paths for connection sharing. There's a link to this article in the resources section of the slide deck. This configuration of shared connections allows you to set up and authenticate the connections once according to your information security policies, and then have users make use of these conformant connections in lieu of their own local connections. The sharing also allows for easy editing should connection details change. Edits could be performed in one main shared location and are reflected in all dependent workspaces. The next section I want to draw your attention to is the documentation help locations. To work fully offline, you'll need to disable the online help documentation, just down here. This little checkbox allows you to disable our online help documentation and make exclusive use of local help documentation stored on your C drive. And finally, the last feature to note in default paths is the shared FME folder space, just at the bottom here. Here, a shared directory that you've already established can be set up with various FME-related subdirectories to hold a variety of FME resources that users can access as required. So I'll just open one of these up for you that I've already set up. And once this is performed, you can see subdirectories for custom transformers, custom coordinate systems, workspaces, and any other resources your users may require, all stored in one shared location. FME will scan these shared folders first for resources used in the workspace in the order in which the folders appear here. This is a great way to set up project-based or user group-based resource directories and provide only those resources that each user group requires to perform their tasks. In this way, users are not required to keep a local copy of necessary resources. And additionally, data managers or admins can readily perform edits to the files in these shared resource folders, and those edits will be reflected throughout the dependent workspaces of users upon the next scan of the folder. And our next stop on our tour of FME options is the Database Connections menu. This menu gives you control over how visible your database connections are to your users once you've made the appropriate adjustments in default paths. You'll see a public column available in your connections table if the default paths adjustments have been successfully made. And once you check the box to make a connection public, any user with access to that shared directory set up for default paths will be able to use that connection. You can also edit your database connections if any connection information changes. Simply right-clicking on the connection and choosing Edit Parameters will open up an Edit dialog for you, and these edits will be reflected in the dependent workspaces. You can also create a new database connection here, though it is often easier to create these connections on the fly from within the Canvas objects as needed. Now looking at the Web Connections menu, you'll see a similar connections table, and again the public column will show up once the configuration changes have been successfully made in default paths. Each web connection seen here is based on a web service definition that you can create from the Manage Services menu just to the right of this table. As you can see in this list of web services along the left here, there are quite a few web service definitions already available out of the box in FME form. Each of these have gone through the applicable app registration process with the web service provider, where the resulting credentials belong to Safe Software. As such, these web services are subject to changes and outages. This is why we highly recommend that you register your own app with the web service provider of interest, thereby obtaining your own web service particulars. So really, consider our web service definitions as guides or examples, but these should not themselves be used to establish your own web connections. You can create your own web service definitions just below this list. You can create OAuth 2.0 web services, token web services, HTTP authentication, or you can choose to create a web service definition from one of our templates. Again, inputting your own web service credentials as needed. The last stop on our tour of FME options today is the Network Proxy menu. This space is where you configure FME Form to work with your system proxy settings if your organization has a proxy server in place. Typically, it's sufficient to use the system proxy settings and specify the appropriate authentication method and credentials to get FME Form working with your proxy server. There is also the option to map access to specific resource URLs through a proxy other than the system proxy if that's needed. This would be handled by a custom proxy map under the advanced options below. In this way, you can bypass the system proxy to gain access to a resource via a separate proxy server as needed. I have one final feature that I'd like to briefly mention today, and that's the Verify SSL certificates option you might see on some of our formats and transformers, such as our HTTP caller that I'm showing here. You may also see this as Verify HTTPS certificates. When enabled, you are obligating FME to do a check on the SSL digital certificates of the target resource provider to verify the legitimacy and trustworthiness of the resource, as well as ensure that a secure encrypted connection can be made between the client and the resource. We recommend that users enable this parameter when transmitting sensitive information from one location to another, whether the target is web-based or not. Data encryption in transit is a powerful way to protect sensitive information from eavesdropping or related attacks. So key takeaways from that demo. Most of what I showed you today can be accessed within FME options. So if you can't quite remember everything that you saw, just remember that you can go to FME options and find most of it there. Password protect those sensitive workspaces. This will encrypt them and prevent unauthorized tampering. Maintain positive control of those sensitive resources through shared resource directories, as well as shared database and web connections by making those adjustments to the default paths menu. Where you can, try making use of database and web connections to keep sensitive information out of the workspace, as well as simplify the authentication process for users. FME can indeed readily work with your proxy servers, so configure proxy particulars from the network proxy menu of FME options. And it's recommended to enable certificate verification on applicable workspace objects to ensure a secure encrypted connection to a target resource. And now I'll hand things over to my colleague Merlin so that she can walk you through some security considerations in FME Flow.
Thank you, Natalie. In this section of the webinar, we'll be looking at application level security that can be configured on the FME Flow web UI. And we'll also be walking through the latest Flow 2023 beta version. The articles and the documents that would be referenced will be available in the resources section of this webinar. And please note that you will need admin access to view and edit these security features in your installation. We'll be going over user authentication, user authorization, system passwords and session management, encryption, token management, system events, web connection, and forward and reverse proxy. Okay, so let's begin with user authentication. FME Flow supports both user and token-based authentication that is configured via the web UI or programmatically using the REST API respectively. We'll be going over token management in a bit, but let's look at user-based authentication. We can create users manually on the user's web page and also assign permissions. But if you would want to use an existing user directory like Windows AD, Azure Active Directory, or other LDAP-based directory, we can create server connections and save significant effort and time. Once the connection is established, we can also import users, roles, and groups. Optionally, with a Windows Active Directory connection, single sign-on can be enabled. With single sign-on enabled, you can select Use Windows credentials on the web UI login instead of typing in your credentials. You can read through our documentation manual, creating an authentication service connection for more information. We can also import users from your organization's SAML identity provider. For more information on this setup, please check out our article Configuring FME Flow for SAML Authentication, where we talk about auth-o Okta, OneLogin, and Azure AD SAML as examples. Okay, now moving on to user authorization. FME Flow controls access to resources either through role-based or user-based access. One way to determine if a user can access a resource is whether the user owns it or has been given permissions on it. As mentioned before, we can assign permissions individually to the users under the permissions section of the user's web page. But this can be a tedious task, and roles make it easy to assign the same set of permissions to multiple users. We can assign permission to specific roles and then apply to the users who belong to that role. We can create new roles and then assign permission and users under the roles web page. The documents role-based and user-based access control and roles explain the two methods and how to set this up in detail. Now, the FME transformation services and data upload service support authentication through HTTP basic auth, where the web services first attempts the credentials of the user account associated with this request, and then the default guest user account. And if for any reason the first two attempts fail, finally, the basic HTTP authentication challenge is used, like a credential request via a web browser. The user account that runs a workspace and requests a service must have run permissions on the repository in which the workspace resides and access permission to the service. Please take precautions when you're authorizing users to use the data upload web services, as we do not perform any checks on the content of these files. We recommend that an anti-malware software be installed to monitor all file uploads into the system. We'd like to point out here that there are certain actions that require the FME super user role to execute, like backup and restore, managing, importing, exporting users' roles and tokens in projects, pausing notifications, selecting show automations or include automations filter in schedules. We'd also like to bring up the user guest. This is a trusted default account named guest that is assigned to the FME guest role. By default, this role is configured to allow unauthenticated access to the web services, and it is possible to invoke a service URL without providing any credentials. You will, however, require permissions in the repository section. You will have to provide this default account with access to the repository of the workspace you want to run. So you can choose which workspace can be run without authorization. So for security reasons, the status of this user account is disabled by default. And we recommend that you remove the guest account after you configure your own set of users and access control for your FME Flow and force all the web services to prompt for authentication. Also, it's a good idea to regularly audit roles to ensure the users still have the appropriate access. You can read more about configuring authentication for FME Flow web services in our document. Next, we can look at system password and session management. For enhanced security, the system administrator can configure a password policy, password expiry, reuse, and recovery for all system user passwords. The password expiry is disabled by default, but if enabled, it will force users to reset their password after the specified time period. The password policy is enabled by default and is customizable. The minimum number of characters can be specified along with other controls on what the password should or should not contain. Password reuse allows you to configure the number of recent passwords that cannot be reused when selecting a new password. To enable password recovery, A system email must be configured, and all users must have an email address associated with their account. System user account passwords are salted with one-way hash, specifically SHA-256, and stored in the database. These passwords are never decrypted, but if you choose to connect and import users from a directory server, these user passwords are not stored on FME server, and they reside with the LDAP server or the identity provider. Now, FME Flow implements functionality that will keep the user session alive for as long as the application is running in the browser. Users should be encouraged to log out of FME Flow when it is not in use. Long sessions that remain active even after long periods of user inactivity are a security risk. And to mitigate this, the system admin can disable multiple web sessions, which is enabled by default. This will restrict users to a single session, forcing FME Flow to log a user out of any previous sessions opened in another browser. For more information, you can check out the linked documentation manual in our resources section called Security. Now moving on to system encryption. FME Flow by default encrypts sensitive data like specific data on your FME Flow database, passwords of configuration backups, secret keys for AWS S3 resource connections. This encryption is managed using an encryption key that is common to any FME Flow installation. We recommend that you enhance encryption security by generating your own encryption key, which you can apply on a rotating basis. When using custom encryption, there are a few pointers that you should keep in mind, like not losing the custom key that you use, backing up and restoring with custom encrypted FME Flow installations, and the re-encryption of FME Flow database password. You can read more about this in our documentation, System Encryption. Let's talk about token security. Access to FME Flow is controlled through security tokens. You can go to Manage Security Tokens webpage under the user settings. Now, FME Flow can receive requests from outside a user session through the REST API, say if you're developing a custom application, or it can receive requests through transformation services. For example, when you submit a job using a webhook URL or workspace app, tokens are encrypted strings passed with the request, bypassing the interactive need to log in to the FME Flow installation. We have two types of tokens. The API token that allows granular access to FME Flow objects, and session token, which are automatically created when you log into the web UI. It grants you a security token to use the interface for a period of 30 minutes. However, FME Flow automatically extends this period if you remain logged in for more than 20 minutes and your browser window remains open. These pages only show the logged in user tokens. Alternatively, you can also use all token web page to view and manage the token of all other users of the system, but your user account must have the manage permission in the user management to see all the other tokens. Now, tokens can be granted a restricted set of permissions and stored securely, and can be set to expire. To guarantee the security of FME Flow, ensure that the token permissions are configured so that it can be used only for its intended purpose, like running a particular workspace. Please note that when all permissions is selected, a token will inherit all the permissions of the token owner's role. So please use this setting carefully. For more information, please read the document Managing Security Token that's also linked in our resources section of the webinar. Now let's go over system events monitoring. FME Flow can publish messages about significant events, such as when a repository is created or a system backup is performed. We can enable or disable and set notifications to the available system events. To access this page, you must have manage permissions on system events on your account. You can monitor system events by sending email notification whenever an event occurs. You can do this via an automations workflow that is initiated by one or more system event triggers, or on the system events history page. You can use the type field to filter by event type. By default, this page displays events from the previous 1 week. For more information, you can check out our document system events. Moving on to web connections. Listed under the Files and Connections webpage, this webpage displays web connections you have uploaded to FME Flow along with your workspaces. You can also upload a web space directly from the Manage Web Services dialog in FME form under Tools, FME Options, Web Connection. This allows you to securely store and reference the authentication parameter to these web services as self-contained objects as they are stored on FME form. The Manage Web Services webpage shows the web services uploaded. To use a web connection, it must be authorized with the web services it references. You can also create new web services via the web UI by specifying the type of service and the connection and authentication parameters. You can only add web connection for services whose definition with FME Flow are complete. Although Safe Software provides web service definition, it is for demonstration purposes only, and we highly encourage you to create your own app in the web service and configure custom web service definition in the FME Flow instead of using uploaded web services from FME form. We also recommend that connections be audited regularly to maintain security. For more information, please see the document Web Connections, which is listed in our resources section. Moving on to proxy. If you're consuming FME web services and your organization uses proxy services on your network, you can configure FME Flow to connect through the proxy. There might be a few instances that might not be supported on a proxy, like certain database connections, if authentication method digest or NTLM is specified, or if, say, certain automations or notification service protocols are used. You can read more about this configuration in our documentation proxy. And finally, we'd like to mention reverse proxy, which is an intermediary server that forwards client requests from internet to your private FME Flow that fulfills requests. We have a detailed article series on how to use reverse proxy with FME server using Nginx or Microsoft IIS server. If you're using topic monitoring, you also have to route your traffic on port 7078 to the active WebSocket server in case another port number is being used here instead of port 7078. You would also have to make some changes on your services URL. You'd have to configure Flow to recognize the reverse proxy URL by updating the service URLs on this page. You might also have to make changes to the reset password section, and the topic monitoring section depends if it's applicable. And for the next section of the webinar, I'd like to hand it over to Richard.
Great. Thanks, Merlin. We've covered a huge range of options for FME security, but there are also ways in which FME Flow can be configured during the installation and setup phase. When you're installing FME server, you have to think about who is running FME. That'd be the service accounts. Where are your temporary files and how are you cleaning them up? And how are you planning for updates? Lastly, what are you doing with your web application server? There's a huge range of flexibility in there, including hosting your own. Go through a couple of these. When you're deploying FME, you can deploy it almost anywhere. We support a range of operating systems: Windows, Linux, Docker, Kubernetes, Azure Marketplace. but we also include options to install either on-premise or in the cloud. If you want to do a hybrid model, that's also an option. You can throw an engine up on the cloud somewhere or on-premise and have the rest of your server in a completely different network. We also have the option to be able to break apart FME server or FME Flow deployments. There's a presentation tier, an application tier, or a data tier if you want to separate it out that way. You can bring your own database if you want. If you have a secure, redundant database, it may be a better option for your organization. Similarly, you can use your own web application server and file share. Service accounts do not need to have administrative permissions, and they can be group managed service accounts. The service account is what runs the engines and gives you permission to network resources or can authenticate your connection through integrated Windows authentication. Temporary files are also important to be aware of. The best thing to do for FME Flow is to set an FME temp variable, and then you can remove the files if any get left behind. This is similar to what we discussed in FME Desktop, but for FME Server. Upgrading. Upgrading is a full installation and reinstallation. There are no patches, so you have to plan for this. And it's important to make sure you have your own script for installing these installations, as there's a lot of options. You also do have the option to upgrade the engine only if you want. That's only between minor versions. And lastly, you have the option to host your own Tomcat and just upgrade that. Moving into the Tomcat or the web application server that we ship with FME, the first thing you want to do is configure it for HTTPS. We have detailed articles and documentation on how to do that. When you're doing that, you can also disable your TLS or enable or disable ciphers in there. There's also options to enhance the security by turning off your X-frame options to prevent clickjacking or changing the X content type options. Now, I'm going to move on to introducing the Trust Center. Soon, we're going to have a Trust Center out on our website where it's going to look at everything around compliance, security, and privacy. Our compliance program is more than ready to help meet your organization's compliance needs. We undergo independent third-party audits and are certified with ISO. Beyond that, we have adopted a culture of incorporating security requirements from first stages of software development, enabling us to add protections early and often. The Trust Center will also cover privacy. Our practices comply with European Union's General Data Protection Regulation and California's Consumer Privacy Act. We also have a vulnerability disclosure program. This is where you can take a look to see what you expect from us to support and what we expect you to support in your installations and setup. Also in this vulnerability disclosure program, there's going to be the official channels for reporting vulnerabilities. If you're an existing customer, please go to your account manager, partner, or create a support ticket. If you're not, there'll be a link in here to allow you to submit vulnerabilities. Lastly, there'll be a white paper. That white paper will be accessible for anyone at any time. Moving on from there, we'll have security updates. This is where we're going to post security updates for everything that we hear about. Often these will be linked to articles where we'll go into more detail and ways of remediating the issue. Lastly, if you want to sign up for security updates to make sure you're on top of it, we're going to have a sign up page there too. So if you're interested right now, you can chat in, opt in to subscribe to FME security updates via email and find out when the Trust Center is out. We're going to move on to resources and our conclusion here. During our presentation, we showcased how you can improve FME security to align with your organization's requirements. However, we also wanted to demonstrate our commitment to security and provide assurance that you can trust FME to manage your data with confidence. Please take a look at the Accelerator course. It's a 90-minute workshop. We also have an ebook on spatial data for enterprise, and stay tuned for more webinars on this and many more topics. We have all our resources here if you want to take a look. Please dive in. The community is very active, and we're always there to answer questions if you have any. We also have the opportunity to claim your community badge for this webinar if you want. Today's code is right there. And please join us at our FME user conference if you can in Bonn, Germany. We're very excited about that. Moving on to the question and answer period. If anyone's got questions, we'll be around for a while to help answer them.
Fantastic. Okay, at this point, I'll get our presenters and optionally our Q&A support if they'd like to come on stage to turn back on our webcams, and we can take a look at the questions that have come in here. Excellent. All right, I did see we got quite a few questions here, so thanks everyone for submitting your questions. Is there any in particular we might want to get started with? I know we've addressed quite a few, or any we want to highlight further?
Yeah, I'll jump in there first. I guess one of the first questions up was just related to the named connections or database and web connections and where they're stored. And they are stored in a key store file. And obviously when the workspace is ran, it accesses that key store internally to pull the credentials out and apply it to the connection it's making to either the web or the database. And then an interesting one on the triggering workspace through a webhook. Technically, that shouldn't happen if you're not on the network where Active Directory would be accessible. It should just kind of detect that that's the case and not present that in that way, or be configurable, because maybe it is something you want to present to the user. But typically, when you're using a webhook, it should be a token-based authentication, and none of that should come into play. So, thanks for those questions, and we'll definitely get an issue filed on that one, just see if there's something we can do there to improve.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Nick. Good to hear from you too. Yeah, that's something that's definitely talked about internally. Some way to manage that remote repository in FME Desktop or FME Flow, where it's stored in an FME form and flow kind of central repository, but nothing yet on that. Know if Natalie, have you come across that request? Have you seen that request? I think it's an insight for us with Nick.
I have not, but it's a good idea for sure. But I haven't come across that idea yet. Definitely worth submitting to the ideas page, or maybe investigating for an enhancement.
Yeah.
So I see a question about FME resources on best security practices for certain workflows. I think when it comes to security, it's so heavily dependent on your organizational best practices that to put together a best practice guide for FME would be challenging. So I think that a start to that would definitely be knowing and understanding in depth your own local data security best practices, and use those as a guide to walk through what you saw today, the features that you saw today. A lot of times, organizational security best practices and policies will guide you to the best methods to use in your own FME workflows.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the product and you find areas of questions, please certainly don't hesitate to reach out to us for clarity on matching that up with your requirement. Yeah. Yes.
All right. Any others we might want to highlight here, team?
Good question just came in from Tobias. That's something I know I've seen a similar request a few times on that, where we can access an external key store location or key vault and be able to use the credentials from there. It's a good one, and yeah, I don't know if there's any work being done on that or thought being done on that. I don't know if Richard, if you've seen anything being able to interact with external key vaults. I haven't
Not
seen
yet.
anything.
No, but it's a great idea. It's something we'll definitely pursue.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. All right. What else have we got?
It looks like we've gotten to most here.
Okay, great. Yes, Joanna, I hope your question was answered by Natalie in the presentation. I was kind of giving you some foreshadowing on my answers to your question, but there you go. But yeah, most people in those cases, when you have a lot of users using similar credentials, you want to manage those centrally, and then you would just change that system share, those in the FME options, point that to a public location, well, on your network, obviously. And then when you're making new connections, you have an option to make it public or private, and job done, right? That's the best way to deal with that. The risk there is that everybody is using it. Someone can change it on everybody, which, you know, most of the time isn't a problem, but just something to be aware of. It's not like you get admin and just user rights to it. So I don't know how to make that different. Natalie, in your testing, did you find anything around issues or anything like that filed on the public named connection file? Because right now, if it's public, everybody can make changes to it, right? It'd be nice to be able to break it down and not have it like that. And that kind of comes back to this central repository or key vault topic as well. So, yeah.
I wonder if you might be able to set up permissions on the share file itself.
Yeah.
And somewhat protect them in that manner. But yeah, as far as the public connections go, if they're public, they're public. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
FME Hub.
Yeah, looks like we just got a question come in here.
Almost like a user group, or like a user space on FME Hub. That's a very good question. I have never seen that, but I can definitely see the use for it. Something else maybe we could take a look at and see if, setting up, pages for organizations or users might be of interest.
That's actually an interesting request. I kind of like the idea of that. In topic of security, it would fall onto FME or safe software to secure that, to ensure that only the users of the company can access it. And I know that would be something that we would probably take very serious and maybe not do. But yeah, it's a good one. I don't know. I wonder if it's better to think about a way to make it internal, FME Hub internal to your organization and act in the same way. Maybe
Yeah,
that's
almost like
the way to tackle
almost
it.
like your own portal.
Yep.
Into
Yeah.
into an FME Hub space. Yeah.
No, that's good. Joanna's asked a good one there. Sorry for your pain, Joanna. Yeah. So I don't know exactly how you were storing that certificate, but when they do update, and in some cases, the root certificates get recycled. We had a few users experience a root certificate rotation on a web service recently that caused them to have an outage for a little while. And I think that was tied to a Windows update that hadn't been applied to their systems that they were on. Regardless, in this case here, yeah, if you're referencing that certificate file somewhere and it's embedded, yeah, you're asking, and the credentials too, it gets pretty gnarly. So I'd like to see you maybe file an issue on that and kind of let's talk about the use case there, and if there's another way we could have implemented that so that you didn't have to do it 22 times. It's a really good one.
All right, looks like we have time for one or two more questions. If we have any others here we want to address. Looks like some ideas have come in from users, so thanks for sharing.
Yeah, Nick shares one there for the custom transformers, just putting them in a shared network location, and that's what we see most customers do in that instance, right? And then you can link or you can embed that transformer that's viewed on your local network. Yeah, good suggestion. Just don't let people make changes to your link transformers willy-nilly. Again, that comes back to Natalie's suggestion about, securing that folder for maybe view read only versus making changes to it, or maybe you only have a couple of users that have that ability. So it's good.
Okay, final call out to the panelists. Any other questions we want to address before we wrap up here?
No, it looks like we got them all at this point.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and huge thank you to our panelists here as well today for all your work creating this content. If you do have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback. It's just a few multiple choice questions, and that helps us continually improve our program. So once again, thank you everyone, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.